You've been following the developments very carefully. How important is this message of Sabka Saath, the message of inclusion, saying Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as he underlined this when he welcomed the African Union formally into the G20 as a permanent member?
The message is crucially important, and finally we'll have something practical coming out of a G20 meeting. The G20 is not known for having practical results, even going all the way back to the global financial crisis in 2008 when it was first founded. Yet here we have the African Union being brought into the G20. That's very, very important symbolically. South Africa has been a member of the G20 from the beginning, but South Africa can't speak for the entire continent. That's 55 countries that are members of the African Union. Now, that said, the African Union is not as cohesive a governance grouping as, for example, the European Union. So the African Union, there will be internal disputes within Africa over the message that Africa will take to the G20 in the future. But this is a tangible benefit nonetheless that will propagate through to future G20 meetings and hopefully to future global governance venues beyond the G20 itself.
Well, we've just got news that this G20, India's G20 presidency has perhaps been the most ambitious in the history of G20. For you, let me ask you, what perhaps is the biggest box that you would like ticked, or has the inclusion of the African Union already ticked that box, Professor Babones?
Look, that symbolic box is really the best we can hope for. There's certainly not going to be a geopolitical consensus around the G20, even with Russia and China absent at the highest levels. Of course, they're both represented, but not represented by their top leaders. There won't be an ability to get a consensus around the table on anything really very tangible. So I think we should take away this African Union win as the big win. That said, this G20 meeting is not really about the G20. Let's face it, this G20 meeting is really about India. The star here is not the G20 or even the leaders who are present. The star here is not even Narendra Modi. The star here is India itself, the host country. This is India's coming out party, and I think everybody who's there is probably thrilled to be part of that. Joe Biden certainly is. Anthony Albanese, Australia's Prime Minister, certainly has cast it that way, and I think Indians should realize that as well.
Bilateral engagements are different, multilateral fora and multilateral understanding is different, the dynamic is different. Will India be able to emerge as the problem solver, Professor Babones? And if India is able to do that, does that mean then it gets a reserved seat at the high table?
India is already a regional problem solver and increasingly sought after beyond its region. But India's seat at the high table is not some kind of reward for India doing good work at the G20. India's seat at the high table, and I believe that next table is going to be the G7. India's seat prospectively at the G7 is really about the success of India, the size of its economy, and the importance of India in the democratic world. I mean, the G7 is the coordinating body for the economic governance of the free world. Well, with India as the fifth largest economy in the world, as the fourth largest democratic country in the economy in the world, soon to be the second largest democratic economy in the world, but certainly by the end of this decade, the G7 is looking not very relevant without India. Now, India has been an observer the last few years. I strongly suspect that India, either at next year's meeting or the one after that, India will soon become an actual member, a formal member of the G7 grouping.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi using the tag of Bharat and not India, is that significant? Is that very important? How would you see that as a sociologist?
It is obviously politically relevant in India, and we're all waiting to see what comes of the special sitting of Lok Sabha after the G20 ends. Internationally, it really isn't that important. Many countries have different names by which they're known internally and externally. There was no controversy when Turkey started insisting on Turkey as its name in international venues. Of course, what we know as the Ivory Coast is known as Côte d'Ivoire officially. Germany is Deutschland within Germany, but it's Germany for us, and it has different names in other countries. It's Alemania in French and Spanish. So for those of us outside India, what Indians decide to call themselves really is nothing we'll question. When they tell us that it's Mumbai, not Bombay, we just start saying Mumbai, or we may use Bombay for historical purposes, but it's not controversial outside India. Of course, inside India is where you'll have the big debate, and whatever Indians decide on this is something that the rest of the world will simply recognize and respect.
Namaste and thank you very much, Ambassador. My first question to you, the Africa Union now a permanent member of the G20. Your thoughts?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a special day today because African Union has joined G20, who will become G21, and we are very proud about it, and we are very thankful to the Prime Minister, to India first, and then to Prime Minister Modi for advocating for Africa and to be the voice of the global South. I am sure that without Africa, the world cannot go on. And without India, the world cannot go on. Now, the conjunction of these two forces, I think, will bring positive things to the world. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, if I may ask you, Djibouti is very strategically placed and there was a very close engagement with China. Today, Djibouti also finds itself in a debt trap. Do you believe nations need to come together to help such nations?
Well, first of all, let me tell you one thing. Djibouti is a sovereign country and has relation with all the world and all countries in the world. But we have to precise that Djibouti has very ancient relations with India, and there is a lot of community living in Djibouti, Indian community. When myself, I have been to school with 5 Indians, and up to now we are still friends from childhood up to now. So these ancient relations that are commercial ties since decades and centuries is bringing us to have new and more connected ties, more connected than before, to bring development to Djibouti and to help India shine all over the world.
Do you believe the African nations should be more involved in the process of contributing to the global economy? Do you agree with India's pitch that emerging nations, including India and a lot of the African nations, should have the first right to use of resources?
Well, absolutely, because the rest of the world must understand one thing. The most populated people are not in Western countries. They are in Asia, in Africa. So putting aside those people will not help the rest of the world. At the opposite, it will even harm them because of migration, because of economical constraint, and because of resources, natural resources, human resources are on the Indian side and African side. So it will be very positive for them to cooperate and to give the priority of their cooperation with India or Africa or the global South, because we must not forget that half of the planet is composed, even more, is composed by the global South. Thank you.
Do you believe the World Bank should come together to help nations who are riddled with debt to try and help them service the debt and also emerge out of a financial crisis? Your Excellency?
I think that the chance of the so-called developed world is to have a strong Africa, a strong India, because now this is the time for global South to raise, and we can see the decline of the economy because of financial crisis of the so-called Western world or Northern world. So. As many leaders have said from the West, now the next place to be is in Africa and India. And we can already see it with India, because India, 60% of the leaders of major CEO of major companies in America are Indian origin. So we can already see how the quality of Indian has been conquering the world. So Africa, with the opportunity given by this to be part of the G20 and to be part of the UN at the Security Council. This is what also another file that Mr. Prime Minister Modi is fighting for Africa. To Africa to be present all the world at the United Nations, at the World Bank, and at the BRICS and at the G20 will also help balance the financial crisis.